In this episode, we're going to talk about the idea of practice and communication and what that looks like in our classroom. When are students practicing with the language, and when are they actually and authentically communicating in the language? And there are times, as you will see, when that practice we think is communication, and when we really look at what communication is, maybe there's some tweaks to it to truly make it communication. So couple of ideas to look at in terms of what happens in our classroom and how we can make it more communicative and what the place of practice actually is. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and as always, thank you so much for being here to be introspective about your teaching, see what other teachers are doing in their classroom, hear about language research, what's going on, and how you can be really confident about what you're doing, see how you can help your students to rise in proficiency a little more. So it makes you an awesome teacher joining us here every week to think about your teaching. Just take a second, make sure that you are liking or subscribing, whatever the app is asking you to do, to make sure that you can get these episodes every Monday when they come out. And it's always helpful if you can leave a really positive rating, hopefully, on Apple Podcasts so that other teachers can discover this podcast and get these episodes and be thinking about their teaching as well. So our topic today, it's just me. I'm going to be here. We're just going to be hanging out together today. And it's this idea of practice, language practice in the classroom and authentic communication. And I think that a lot of times, I can speak personally for myself, for many years, what was a lot of practice, I kind of understood as communication, but it wasn't really communication. And what we're finding through research and just tried and true practice in the classroom with students and what they're able to do is that when they are authentically communicating with the language, they are retaining structures. They are having subconscious development of language as they're seeing it and using it in context. So the more that we can provide these opportunities for students to actually communicate in the language and move beyond this idea of practice, the more they're going to have that subconscious language system developing. And also, when it comes to proficiency, we really want students doing something with the language. That's the whole point of learning language, whether it's to read in the language, to hear something in the language and interpret what it's saying, or use the language to engage interpersonally. Whatever it is, our goal with students is to get them communicating with the language. It's all of our goal with our languages is to communicate with the language. And practice has a part in that. But I really want to look at how we start maybe with that idea of practice and make sure that we get to this place of truly communicating with the language and not leaving it in that practice area, which, again, I'll speak for myself. For many years, that's what I saw was happening. And then the more I engaged with what was happening with language teaching and the research with it, I said, okay, maybe the reason why students aren't communicating is because I'm not really giving them opportunities to communicate. So we're going to look at some of our teaching and where is that idea of practice, and can we turn it into more communication, more authentic communication. So I want to start with a couple of really useful terms so that we're all, when we use these words, we're all using them in the same way and have a common understanding. So let's start with the word communication. Like if we say we are communicating, now if we truly understand what communication is, then we can immediately see whether or not what our students are doing in the classroom is communicating. So I'm going to use Sandra Savignon's definition of communication, which is readily available. I've heard a lot of people talk about it. Bill Van Patten uses this. So her definition of communication is the expression, interpretation, and very often negotiation of meaning in a given context. Communication has purpose. That last part is really, I think, what it all comes down to. Communication has purpose. So when we're looking at practice, a lot of times it might end up staying in that mechanical drill realm, and you're not actually doing something with the language. So if we just always come back to, is there a purpose in what students are doing as they're engaging with the language, or are they just reciting patterns or writing patterns of verb forms or something like that? Like, what is the communicative purpose? Now, when we say it has purpose, the purpose isn't to learn the conjugations. The purpose isn't to know the adjective forms, but it's okay, or you know those verb conjugations, but what can you actually do with it? So what is the purpose of your communication? So if we're having students communicate, it is an actual purpose to achieve something. And that can be in any of the modes. It could be interpretive, where they're reading or listening to something, but there's a purpose to doing that. Not to just pick out the adjectives, but once you've picked out the adjectives, how does that help you to understand what you're listening or reading? So communication has purpose. The next word I want to take on is the word proficiency. So when we talk about proficiency, this is what students can do with the language. Again, in all of the modes, whether it's speaking, writing, listening, reading, interpretive, presentational, all of the modes. So it's what students can do with the language in real world situations that are spontaneous and unrehearsed when it comes to interpersonal. It might be a little more polished when it comes to the presentational writing, but when it comes to interpersonal language and proficiency, we really are looking at spontaneous and unrehearsed language in real world situations. So we want to see students do something with the language. So it's not just learning about the language. Proficiency is all about what students can do, I always say, in and with the language. So simply stated, that's what it is. It's not only what you know about the language, but what you can do with and in the target language. So we have communication. So it's using the language with purpose. And then proficiency is what you can do with the language and not simply what you know about it. So now let's look at this distinction between practicing with the language and communicating with the language. And I am always brought back to my experience in Nicaragua, where I work with incredibly dedicated teachers who have limited resources, but they do wonderful work with the students. And this is a place where I really see the true value in focusing on the student and individual needs. When I look at what they're doing, they use this mantra, which they say, learn, practice, apply. They say it in Spanish, but this idea of when they're with a student, that they are learning something, they're practicing something, but they're applying it. And they constantly say that. They say APA when they use the Spanish words. It's their acronym. And it's looking at this idea that, yeah, they've learned this, say it's math. Yes, they've practiced how to do subtraction or addition, but how are they going to actually use it and apply it? And so they constantly call me out when I'm working with students and say, okay, they're practicing it, but what are they going to do with it? And I'm always reminded, and I need that reminder every time. And I bring that back to my classroom, that everything we're doing is they've learned these language elements. They are acquiring this vocabulary. They have this knowledge, but then what are they actually going to do with it? And I think that speaks to Savignon's quote, the citation of how she sees the idea of communication, that it has purpose. So everything we're learning and practicing, make it have a purpose. I don't think that everything is an all or nothing when it comes to language teaching or teaching in any way. And I'm really feeling inspired by Hawkins and Henshaw's new book called Common Ground. You might see it all over social media right now. I got my paper copy and I'm diving into it right now. And it's this idea of there's research and different teachers are doing things, and you may see what you're doing in there, you may not, but it's not going to be an all or nothing. So even as we're looking at this practice and communication, it's not going to be an all or nothing. Spend some time with the Common Ground book. You'll get some insights from that. For our purposes today, I really do want to make that distinction between practice and communication with students. So let's look at what practice looks like in the classroom, and let's be truly introspective about what we're doing with our students. Practice has a place. I never want to say do it this way. You have to absolutely do it this way. Every conversation we have on this podcast is an opportunity to think about how we're teaching, how we could modify it if we're on the right track. That's what this is always about. It's never about stop what you're doing, but it's an opportunity to reflect on what we're doing and how we're doing it. And if you end up in a place where you want to modify something based on something that you hear on this podcast, that's awesome. If you disagree with it or you've had a different experience, that's equally valuable. So always remember that my goal is for us to think about our teaching, to really find reasons to justify or support what we're doing, or to modify it if we are open to seeing it in a different way. So when we look at practice in our classroom, and it has a place, it's accuracy-based. Practice is usually on very correct examples of language where we want students to focus in on and use language in a correct way. And what ends up happening with that is it's out of context because it's just past tense verbs. It's just adjective forms, but they're very focused on just using them in that place. It's devoid of context for the most part. So we're practicing and honing a skill on a very particular point or a vocabulary theme. And so that means that the focus is on producing very small amounts of language. And what we are doing in those moments is we are dictating the structures and vocabulary that students are using. So that's what practice is essentially. So it's accuracy-based, small amounts of language. The language tends to be out of context, and it's focused on small amounts of language that we dictate to students, whether that's structures or vocabulary. So if we go back to our original idea of communication, when I use the words spontaneous and unrehearsed, it's not spontaneous, it's not unrehearsed when it's practiced because we are dictating the structures and they're devoid of context. Now, again, practice has a place because we do want students to perhaps really hone their skills on a particular area. But just like I learned from those teachers all the time in Nicaragua that, yep, they've learned it and they've practiced it. But now what are they going to do with it? And I think in our legacy language classrooms, we tend to leave it there at that practice place. I don't say we're doing that now, but that has been the practice in the past, is to keep it in that place of just practice in the classroom. But if we're going to do that, and again, it can have a place, we want to make sure that we are then providing opportunities for communication as well, so that students are using that structure that they practice or that vocabulary they practiced in a communicative experience, in a communicative realm in the classroom as well, because that's what's going to help them to truly acquire that structure or that vocabulary, because it is connected to other contextualized events. So that's what practice is. So now let's look at what communication would be. So communication is purpose-based, and it is truly focused on achieving communication. So that means that it's not hyper-focused on the accuracy of the structure that you might have been practicing. So now it's purpose-based and it's focused on communication and the meaningful use of language. So I'm saying meaningful as opposed to accurate. Although it does have to have a certain level of accuracy for the communication to happen. So I think a lot of times when we talk about communicative language teaching, there's this idea that it throws accuracy out the window. It doesn't, because your language does have to have a certain level of accuracy for communication to happen. So that's why I say there is a place for practice, but let's not leave it there. So if they don't have that structure, at least learned, if it's not yet acquired, it's at least at that learned place, then they're unable to communicate. So it is a starting point with that practice, but we want to make sure that they can pull from that repertoire of learned language, which will then help to bring it to their learned language system. That just got very theoretical for a second. So as students are engaging in communication, they are using communication strategies because they're engaging in unpredictable language. When you keep it in the practice realm, they only have the structure that you're working on. They only have the vocabulary that they are practicing. And so there's no opportunity for unpredictable language. And that's usually where communication breakdown happens, is when students see that unpredictable language, because we don't give them enough of an opportunity. And they feel like they need it always to be accurate because of that practice focus so much. But when it gets into communication, it's not always going to be accurate. And we have to get our students comfortable with producing language that is accurate enough to communicate an idea or thought or get their meaning across. But if we keep it in that practice realm, it gives this idea that it always has to be perfect. And if it's not perfect, I'm not going to say it. So if we want spontaneous and unrehearsed language, we have to make sure that we're providing opportunities with communication for students to do that. So if we stay again in this communicative realm, that language is connected to a context because they're communicating a meaning, whereas in that practice realm, it's usually devoid of context. And the other thing that is truly different from practice and communication is when students are authentically communicating, we're not dictating the language structures for them to use. Whereas if they're practicing, we might say, even if we think it's communicative and it's communication, and we say, I want you to tell your partner 3 things you did last weekend and make sure you put it in the past tense. So even though we try to make it communicative, we try to say true, authentic communication, as soon as we dictate the language structure, we've taken the communication off. Whereas if we just simply say, tell them 3 things you did last week, that turns it more into communication because we're not dictating the language structure. So these aren't necessarily huge changes I'm suggesting. It's actually telling them less or giving them less and having them figure it out more on their own is when they're truly grappling with this idea of communication. As we are looking at ways to practice and communicate in our classrooms, I want to put a few more terms out there as we're looking at what we're doing. And it's the terms of doing practice and then an activity in the classroom and then a task. And I'm pulling from Bill Van Patten's work with this. But as I said, with practice, we're really focused on mechanics such as verb and adjective forms, filling in the blank, gap fills, anything like that. And it's a practice place, doing verb conjugations or adjective forms or thematic vocabulary and looking at noun genders, anything like that. But practice is usually based on mechanics. So if that's your starting point, try to get it past that and at least move into what we refer to as an activity, which does have some mechanics, but it also has meaning, right? So you might have a focus on verb and adjective forms, but it's based on using something like maybe a time adverb that would help them to put it in a time and space with the language rather than just say, do all of these in the present tense. You could say, in this activity, you're going to write about 3 things that you normally do on a Wednesday morning. So again, you're not saying write 3 things in the present tense, but by saying 3 things you do on a Wednesday morning. So that puts some meaning onto it. So we have practice, which is just mechanics. We have activity, which is focused on mechanics. You want them to do it in the present tense, but without saying that, you put a context on it. So 3 things you normally do on a Wednesday morning. But then the third level of that is a task, where with a task, the objective is other than the language. Whereas in the activity, the objective was still to get students to say something in the present tense or write something in the present tense. When it comes to a task, the objective is not the production of language, but it is finding information. So it's not just write 3 things you normally do on a Wednesday morning. The ultimate task would be you need to find in your group of 4 2 things that you all do on Wednesday morning. So therefore, it's a task. So the task is not to say what you do on Wednesday mornings. The task is to find the commonality that all of you do. So that will require saying what you do, 2 or 3 things you do on a Wednesday morning, but also listening to what the other students are doing and coming up with those common things that you do. So with practice, it's mechanics devoid of meaning. So just write these verbs in the present tense. An activity is mechanics, but has some meaning on it, right? So that would be write 3 things that you do on a Wednesday morning. But then a task is actually taking that meaning and doing something with it, where your actual objective is other than the language. So those 3 things or 2 or 3 things that within your group you all do on a Wednesday morning. So if you're doing practice, start by trying to make it an activity by putting some meaning onto it, not just the mechanics. And then ultimately, we want our students to do tasks in the classroom where they're not just focused on the form meaning connection, but actually doing something with the language. So the objective is other than language. I always come back to that learn, practice, apply from the teachers in Nicaragua. It's definitely this idea of they learned it and they've done an activity to practice it, but the task is to actually apply it. So I always come back to that learn, practice, apply, learn, practice, apply. So I want to talk a little bit more about assessment when it comes to this idea of practice and communication in the classroom. And if we have the student mindset focused on communication rather than just practice, the language they have about their language learning is going to change a little. So in the practice focused experience of the classroom, students are going to be focused on what their grade is. What is my grade? Because practice means there's a right and wrong way of doing it. But if we can focus more on communication in the classroom, we want students to have that what is my grade more focused on what progress am I making? What do I have to work on? And am I progressing toward the goal, which will be to do this task? If we are just doing practice, we're not really focused on what the ultimate task objective is going to be. Like, why are you learning these verb forms? It's so that you can do this. Also, in that practice-focused mentality, there's this idea of what's right and wrong or correct and incorrect. Whereas with communication, you're working towards a goal that might be more spontaneous language, and the focus is more on what structures and vocabulary do I need to be able to accomplish this goal in one of the modes, whether it's listening or reading or speaking or having a conversation about. So it's not about getting language structures right and wrong. It's about having the language I need to reach that goal. And this is where backwards planning comes in, right? Where we want when we start a unit, like the goal is for students to do this with the language and then work backwards from there. So maybe there's some practice and then some communication, and we're doing some ideas of a practice activity, and then we have an activity that has meaning, and then a task that eventually gets them to that objective. So to recap a bit about this whole idea of practice and communication in our classroom, I want to go back to Sandra Savignon's definition of communication. And she essentially says that communication has meaning. So the language students are engaging with in the classroom has meaning. It's not just left at that practice mechanics devoid of context level. So since practice is focused on mechanics, we want to make sure that we're moving past that so that communication is happening, that there's communication and working towards a goal of being able to do something with the language. And again, that doesn't always necessarily mean speaking and having a conversation about, because we want to keep all of the modes in mind. This could be an interpretive task, whether it's reading or listening to something, watching a video. Those can also be the goals when we're talking about communication. So if we have those practice places in our classroom and we find value in honing some particular skills or thematic vocabulary, we want to make sure that we're also providing opportunities for students to authentically communicate using that and not keeping it in that practice realm. And that is going to mean having tasks that students can accomplish using what they have honed in those practice moments. You know, if it helps you to remember that learn, practice, apply that I referenced from those teachers in Nicaragua, it's like that apply stage. I keep that in mind all the time when students are doing something, where I say, are we just practicing this? Have I given them an opportunity to apply and or communicate with this? Because we know that from our research and our findings in linguistics and second language acquisition, that when students are using what they're learning in that practice place in a communicative way and truly and authentically communicating with it, that's when it's going to go from that learned place to that acquired place in their mind brain. As I'm kind of quoting a little bit of Stephen Krashen and Bill Van Patten there, but when we take those structures and that vocabulary and we use it in communicative settings that have context, that's what's going to help to move it to acquired language and not just learned. So there's that place for practice, but let's make sure that we're bringing it into a communication space as well, because ultimately that's what we want our students doing with language, is communicating, and it's also going to help with their language development as well. So be sure to check out the show notes because you can see the link there to sign up for Talking Points, which is my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. I touch upon a lot of the things that we're talking about here, and I often link to blog posts on different things. Sometimes it has to do with our episode for the week on the podcast. Sometimes it's something different or other resources for your classroom. So be sure to sign up for that. The link is in the show notes. You will also see a link to get in touch with me if you would like to work together, either in person in your school or remotely. I'm doing a lot of remote workshops right now where there's an opportunity for teachers to watch videos on workshops that I typically do in person, and then the teachers in your department can submit questions, and I do a response video responding specifically to your questions. So that's all done asynchronously within your department. I actually just did a Q&A video before I recorded this episode this morning. So it's definitely happening a lot. But also I'm getting out into schools and conferences as well. And so if you would like an opportunity to work together so we can really hone our language teaching skills and see what that looks like in your classroom, reach out to me through the links in the show notes as well. And I would love to come and work with you. So I hope you can take this idea of practice and communication and look at what that looks like in your classroom. And I'd love to hear how it's working for you and get some ideas from you, and we can share with other teachers as well. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. You've been listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss a single episode. Let's continue the conversation on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at WL Classroom. You can also see over 250 blog posts about language teaching at, you guessed it, WLClassroom.com.